What is up, YouTube? Welcome back to another iteration of my Master Duel tier list, which I haven't done a whole lot. I think I've only done one so far in general. I'm not sure. Maybe it's been two. But people keep asking me, you do a lot of TCG tier lists. What do you think of the current Master Duel meta? And we're going to do it today because we've just recently had a relatively massive Forbidden Unlimited list update. And by that, I mean the second last one, not the last one. And we've got some new impactful cards, so I'm here to talk about it real quick. As always, if a deck is not on here but you are still interested in it and what I think of it, you can leave a comment down below. We've been getting a lot of comments, so I've not been able to answer every single one of them, but I'll try my best to answer any of your questions on what I think of any certain deck in the current Master Duel environment. Just as a disclaimer, almost every single one of the decks that we're going to talk about today are completely fine to play in ranked. So if you're not happy with how high I'm gonna rank X or Y deck today, just let it be known that I think all of these decks are capable of performing well on the ladder, and I think if you like one of these decks, they are completely viable decks. That's why they're included here in the first place. This is mostly about the distinction within the best decks in the game, rather, right? That being said, let's hop right in. I personally like Vanquish Soul. I'm still gonna put it into tier 2, which is good. It's a good deck in Master Duel right now. However, my biggest issue with the deck whenever I'm playing it personally is just consistency. The deck is a pretty well positioned mid-range deck, honestly, especially if it draws a good hand. It's very, very potent. It's got very strong control over the game, especially going first with like opening Raisin and stuff like that. If you can pull off the Jiaolong combos, your card advantage is just insane. Very hard to break the board if you include the Vanquish Soul trap card in it. I think it just suffers from the fact that you only have one prosperity. Not drawing Raisin is a problem, and the fact that you need to play cards like Droll and Lockbird also doesn't help because it doesn't have one of the attributes that are needed for Vanquish Soul, right? And so like sometimes you draw these awkward hands. It's a solid deck. It's just a little bit of a gamba on whether you're going to draw Raisin or not. I've been messing around with Dragon Link a little bit after the most recent Forbidden Unlimited list update without Chaos Ruler and all that kind of stuff. I still think the deck is okay, especially for laddering up to Master 1. I think it's fine. I've been messing around with like slower versions of the deck that focus less on going like full combo and more so try to end on like seals, some hand traps. I went back to playing Chamber Dragon Maid with the trap card. I think that deck is fine. I think it's somewhere between the lower end of tier 2, maybe upper end of tier 3, but I honestly was doing okay with it. So I think just for like the ranked environment, I'll put it into tier 2. It's just a very different deck from beforehand, of course, like without the baby dragons and all that kind of stuff. It's not the exact same, but I've been doing okay with it. And bottom of tier 2, I think that's low enough. Stun is a deck that I personally hate, and I was very happy to see a lot of the floodgates that they hit on the early 2024 Forbidden Unlimited list update. So I would love to tell you that you should not be playing this deck. Unfortunately, in a best of one, the amount of times that I just queue into stun on ladder and they summon a Patchy Cephalo, equip it with a Moon Mirror Shield or whatever else you can think of, the amount of times I just lose to that going second, it's not zero, unfortunately. At the very minimum, it's a playable deck. I think the core problem with stun remains that it's not very good at going second, which is going to give it that sort of 50% win rate to it. I don't think it gets much better than that. For going second, most of the decks in the game right now are just gonna beat it. Sky Striker, for me personally, the only really viable way to have been playing Sky Striker was with like a blind second, Talons thrust evenly sort of approach. I thought that was okay in past formats. I think specifically right now, that deck is not as good because of mainly Superheavy Samurai being a deck that you really can't afford to blind second against with board breakers. Unless you change up the list, maybe you can mess around with some Dark Ruler no more and stuff like that. Against most other decks, against most mid-rangey decks, I think it's okay to blind second with Sky Striker. You're gonna perform all right, and I do think it's still possible to make like master with it, but it's just not my favorite off of this list. Gold Pride Punk, I think I'm using mostly Dragon Link as like a benchmark here. I think for a ranked setting, Gold Pride Punk is good enough to see play. I don't think it's super strong, but I think there's a mix between like, okay, you can play a decent amount of hand traps, you have a decent amount of extenders. The combo that the deck performs is not super strong, but if you back it up with 1 or 2 hand traps, it's usually good enough. I think it's all right. Rika Sun Avalon, I don't even know why I included this. The problem with Rika Sun Avalon is just I've never thought it was good in Master Duel because it's like one of the weakest decks in 2maxi out there, and it's also not great at going second. saying, I don't really ever see this deck on ladder. And I think specifically right now, I wouldn't be doing it because the deck is not great against Droll and Lockbird. If you look at the most recent card popularity update rankings, whatever you want to call it, Droll and Lockbird, what was it, like 70%? Like, people are terrified of Superheavy Samurai. It's just not a great position to be in when you play Rika, so I'm gonna throw it into tier 3. Tier elements, I think it's about time we accept the fact that it's not that good anymore. You guys are saying tier element's strongest, but I actually don't think this deck is very good. Like, no Merly, no Kelbeck, no Agido. Like, the deck just feels so powerless. Yeah, you have Kikkolos, but Kikkolos alone is actually, I don't think it's carrying the deck. This deck doesn't even feel cohesive to me anymore. And without Chaos Ruler as well, maybe when we get like the Horus engine in Master Duel and you can do like zombie vampire stuff consistently, but I'm not seeing it very much and I don't like it much personally. So that's where I'm gonna put it. Superheavy Samurai is going to be our first tier 1 deck of the discussion. I think the deck is, without a doubt, incredibly strong and incredibly scary. For good reason, people are going very, very anti-Superheavy Samurai in their builds, with like main deck Droll and Lockbirds and all that kind of stuff. You even see Ghost Ogre popping up here and there because it's very good against Vakaushi in the Scale or Scarecrow. I do think, however, I don't think this deck feels that great to play. But that is going to be a theme of this tier list. I personally think that there is no deck actually in Master Duel right now that just feels perfect. There's genuinely no deck right now that I feel like is the best or like super good actually, because Superheavy Samurai in theory is the deck with the highest ceiling, with the biggest amount of power, but it's also one of the most hated decks, not just by players but also just in deck building, right? People are super preparing for Superheavy Samurai, and you also have very limited tools to beat those kind of cards that lose you the game. Like Droll and Lockbird and Maxi are huge issues. Okay, you have Ash for Maxi, fair enough, but still only a 3 of. You're not able to play Called By or Crossout, which is an issue. You have Gamma, but just a little advice on the side. If you're playing against Superheavy Samurai and you have Maxi or Droll, just wait until they have a monster to play around Gamma. Because then if you have Droll, they legitimately have no out to it. And if you have Maxi, they only have Ash, which is not that likely, right? Just don't throw those cards as soon as you can. Throw them as soon as they have one monster on the board, and then they are very, very unlikely to even have a way to out it. Now, of course, the main way that Superheavy Samurai deals with Maxi or Droll is you just try to go Baguska pass. Decks that are good under Baguska have a better time against Super Heavy than decks that aren't. But still, overall, I think Superheavy Samurai is, while it is very scary, I don't think it is the perfect deck or anything like that. I still think it should be hit on like upcoming Forbidden and Limited lists, because I'm not a big fan of how the deck plays. You know, the combo decks, I don't like them, you know that. Branded is another deck that is, I think it's hard to argue with the fact that Branded is a tier 1 strategy right now. I personally am not the biggest fan of Branded. I think Branded in particular has a few issues though, and I'm not gonna say your typical, oh, Ash Blossom beats the deck, right? But I think Superheavy Samurai is, I'm not gonna say bad, but it's a weird matchup, because even if you have Maxi or Droll against Superheavy as Branded, your deck is very bad against Baguska, and that is an issue, as opposed to something like, for example, if you're playing Labyrinth and you Maxi or Droll Superheavy and they end on Baguska, you typically don't care. That's something that Branded does not have. I think Branded is an okay deck. I'm not in love with it, but I'm still gonna throw it into tier 1. Exo Sister, I think, is actually like not terrible right now. It's probably even better than Gold Pride, honestly. You just play a whole lot of Exo Sister starter cards and you pair it up with, you know, Droll, Ash, Maxi, Shifter. The deck does suffer to Droll a little bit. If you're playing Exo Sister, you're probably gonna play Shifter. You're probably gonna play Called By. So you already have a decent amount of outs to Droll and Lockbird, because it doesn't work under Shifter. I think Exo Sister is actually decently positioned into the metagame right now. Runic decks in general have suffered a lot in the recent weeks, because Fountain to 1 was rough, Destruction to 1 was rough. The top tier decks being Super Heavy and Branded also really doesn't help. Branded specifically is a hard matchup for Runic because of its resource game. Runic really excels at trying to run your opponent out of resources, and Branded really typically is almost not possible to be run out of resources. Super Heavy is a very coin flip heavy matchup because if you go first, you can beat it relatively easily. If you go second, you usually don't have enough hand traps. If you want to play Runic, you can. It's 100% possible to make Master 1 with Runics. I've been laddering with Runics a decent amount on my streams and it's been going okay. The deck's matchups across the board are fine. It's just Branded and Super Heavy that are dangerous, and both of those are decently popular, but they're not unwinnable either. I've been playing like Maxi, Ash, and Droll together as my non-engine in most of my Runic decks, and with those, you have a decent chance at beating those decks. For me personally, they settle somewhere here, but that's only because I like them a lot, right? For people that don't like Runic decks, they might be somewhere like lower, like towards the end of tier 2. I think these three are currently the best Runic versions available in Master Duel. Runic Naturia, Runic Bestial, and Runic Sprite for hire. I think the best of the three is still Runic Naturia. I think Runic Bestial is towards the end of tier 2, and I think Runic Fur Hire Sprite is the best Runic Sprite version, but I still think it's tier 3. My biggest problem with Fur Hire Runic Sprite is that it has the biggest space issues out of all the Runic decks. Like I said, I've had no problem fitting Droll, Ash, and Maxi into my Runic Naturia and into my Runic Bestial decks, but I have had issues keeping it 40 cards in Runic Fur Hire Sprite because that deck is freaking tough to fit those cards in. It's also the weakest into Maxi as well, and Droll, because of like Fossil Dig and Rex. Kashtira is, in my opinion, solid, at the very least here, because it's just a lot of powerful one card alongside the room to play hand traps and shifter. It does struggle with consistency a little bit because they have done mostly consistency hits to it, which I'm not a fan of, but then if it ever does draw a good hand, you are pretty good to go. You still do whatever you want to do. You could even argue it's better than Vanquish Soul. I think it's close between the two. You're not wrong. It's not unreasonable to think that. I just like Vanquish Soul a little bit more, but that also might just be because I think it's more fun. We've got Labyrinth, which is definitely a tier 1 strategy for me personally, and that is bias. I'm saying it up front. I've been liking Labyrinth more than the other two tier 1 decks. It is the kind of deck that I would like though, right? I like Labyrinth because it doesn't suffer from some of the most common silver bullets in people's decks, right? It doesn't care that much about Maxi. It doesn't care about Droll at all. That's just a good feeling. I like queuing into ranked knowing that my deck is good against the most commonly played non-engine cards. That's something I think is a good edge to have. Going second, the Labyrinth deck has a lot of room for the hand traps that are good into the format. So if you're playing into the other top tier decks, you know, you have room for Droll, you have room for Ash. So the deck is, I think, fine going second. And then the deck is obviously really strong going first. I think one of my favorite things about Labyrinth in general is a very underrated quality of the deck is the fact that Droll and Lockbird is almost mandatory right now if you want to respect Super Heavy Samurai, but it is not good in every matchup, right? If you draw a Droll and Lockbird against Labyrinth, or you draw a Droll and Lockbird against one of the shifter decks, if you ever have a dead Droll and Lockbird in your hand, I think it's good if you have a deck that can consistently make use of it, and Labyrinth is one of those decks. You can consistently discard your Droll and Lockbird. That's something I like about it if you don't need it for a specific situation or matchup. For me personally, if there was a tournament tomorrow for Master Duel, I would probably play Labyrinth, so I have no choice but to probably put it the highest into tier 1. It would be my choice for a tournament at the moment because I simply think it's the best deck that has balanced matchups across the board, going first, second against the most common tech cards. Like when I'm playing Super Heavy, it feels way more like I'm gambling. Does my opponent have Droll? Does my opponent have Maxi? All that kind of stuff, right? And with Labyrinth, it doesn't feel that gambly, right? Which makes me think it's better. Vanadium is interesting because I think the deck is strong, yet I'm not really seeing anyone play it. Maybe it's because it requires a lot of ultras, but I would personally rate Vanadium relatively high. I'm not gonna put it into tier 1 because it also suffers from the most common hand traps, which are Droll and Maxi, obviously. And people are super prepared for Super Heavy, which also means they're prepared for Vanadium, but I still think the deck is scary. I'm gonna leave it up here. Math Mech, I have no choice but to probably crown the king of tier 2, even though you guys know my opinion about Math Mech. On the one hand, it's in a very good spot right now because First of all, the most recent Forbidden and Limited list did nothing to it. The limiting of diameter also did nothing to it. So the deck is essentially full power. In a nutshell, Mathmech is just one card combo and you fill up your deck with a ton of non-engine, which is usually hand traps. As a result, this deck just has all the room in the world to play your Drolls, your Maxis, but even more hand traps than just that. You can fit Ghost Ogres and all that into the deck as well if you want to. You even have room to play Bell if you want to cover for Labyrinth as well. That concept is really strong right now. The only reason why I'm throwing it not into tier 1 is the fact that it also does lose to other people doing the same thing, right? Like it does lose to Maxi, it does lose to Droll. It has outs to those cards, but I still don't think it's a tier 1 strategy, but it is by far, I think, the best tier 2 deck in the game. Pearly is still playable, even though people don't really play it, but you can still play a solid hand trap based Pearly list. I wouldn't advise anyone to go second with Pearly. There's been a time you could have played blind second Pearly and try to break boards. Right now is not that time. Right now is not the time to go second into decks like Labyrinth, Superheavy, and Branded and all that. You want to go first, you want to play hand traps, and your plan is just set up a Noir or set up a leap play with Sleepy Memories to draw some cards in your opponent's standby phase, draw into hand traps that way. It's weaker, definitely. I would settle it somewhere in tier 2. It's gonna get a huge boost once it gets the rank 2 Noir. I think then we might be talking a very viable tier 2 strategy again, like top of tier 2, maybe even tier 1 again. I'm not sure, but I think right now it's like somewhere in the middle of tier 2. I'll say one thing about Sword Soul. Sword Soul is not a bad deck. I've been playing against Sword Soul, and even if they've drawn the most broken custom hands ever, it still feels like a close game. Like I go first against Sword Soul, they maxi me, they ash me, they roll me, they have Desires, Mohi, Longyan, whatever, all that, and it still feels like it's a close game. That just can't be good. This deck, even if you can almost pick your hand out at the beginning of the game, you're still gonna have to work for it. It's like, I don't know, man. That deck is just too fair, is what everyone always says, but it is true. It just holds up. So it's playable, but it's not great. Numeron is the first deck that I'm going to throw in Do Not, because blind second strategies I don't think are good right now, because even if you draw all the Kaijus or Lava Golem or whatever, that's not enough against Super Heavy. That's not enough. So blind second, not a thing right now. Really not a thing. This goes for all the other decks as well. Like I said, blind second versions of Pearly or Kashtira, or blind second Sky Striker. We've talked about that already. Same is true for Mikanko, whatever. All those kind of things, I wouldn't recommend doing it right now. I really wouldn't. Doesn't mean that you can't cheese a win here and there from some of the other decks, but your overall win rate is just not going to be great against Super Heavy, Vanadium, and Labyrinth too. Like Labyrinth going first is also really bad for these kind of decks. So yeah. Rescue Ace, I've included it because I think it's worth a mention. I've been saying this in the past, but Rescue Ace is not good right now. But if you have the Rescue Ace cards during the time in the shop, don't get rid of them, because the cards are going to be very good at some point, and it's going to hurt if you have to go back and you can't get them from another dedicated pack because they're gone now. So make sure you keep the cards around, because at some point they're going to be good. And that's my tier list. As you can tell, I didn't put anything into tier 0, even with Superheavy Samurai seeming like maybe it would be deserving of that, or people are saying like Branded is tier 0. I don't think so. I think all of the decks that I even put into tier 1 have very distinct flaws. There's no deck right now in Master Duel where I'm looking at it and I'm like, yeah, that deck is so good, I don't see a reason to play anything else, or like I'm super happy with it. The deck that's closest for me personally is Labyrinth. I like Labyrinth. I think it's good. It feels nice to play a deck that doesn't care that much about Droll in a format where everyone plays Droll, but that's just me. And even then, I'm not delusional enough to think that Labyrinth is a tier 0 strategy. It's not that good. That being said, almost all of these decks are still very, very playable, like I said in the beginning, so don't be mad if I put your Fluandereeze deck in tier 3. If you like Fluandereeze, even the fact that I included it here, tier 3 still means that it's a playable deck and it can make Master. If there's any deck I haven't included though, and you want my opinion on, as always, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below and I will try to answer as many as possible. Let me know what you think of competitive Master Duel content as always, because I know my YouTube channel is more focused on TCG, but I'm not opposed to doing Master Duel content at all. So let me know if there's anything specific you want to see on Master Duel and how you like the Master Duel content in general. Without further ado, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Comment, like, subscribe, all the good stuff. Say goodbye to YouTube, Twitch chat, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye. Thank you for watching.